Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Darkveil. Today we're bringing you 10 of the most disturbing true trucking stories ever submitted to this channel. These accounts come from long-haul drivers, dispatchers, and mechanics who've spent years on the loneliest highways in America. Men and women who don't scare easy. And these are not campfire inventions. Every detail you're about to hear was too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We cross-checked what we could. Dispatch logs, maintenance records, local highway advisories, and the trail kept leading back to something real. Tonight, a voice on the radio that shouldn't exist, a hitchhiker who knows a load number before it's even assigned, and a ghost town that's somehow still open for business. If you drive at night, or you know someone who does, this one might hit closer than you'd like. Subscribe, hit that bell, and stay with us. Because this channel is built on slow-burning authentic horror, not cheap jump scares. And if you've had something happen out on the road, tell us in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Now kill your dome light, and let's begin. By the time the sun came up, I'd been sitting in that same spot for 6 hours, staring at a string of taillights that stretched up the grade in front of me like a strand of red Christmas lights. And when the light finally came, there weren't any trucks up there at all. No trucks, no tracks in the snow, nothing. Just my own rig, sitting alone, on an empty stretch of I-80. Engine still running, heater blowing warm air, on a face that had gone numb from watching something that, as far as I could tell now, had never been there in the first place. I need to back up and tell this the way it actually happened, because if I just tell you the ending, you'll think I made it up. And I've had 19 years of people not believing the things that happen out on that road in the winter. I've been driving since I was 23. Dry van, general freight, nothing glamorous, just boxes of whatever needs to get from one warehouse to another. For most of those 19 years, I've run the same lane, Cheyenne down to Salt Lake and back. 3, sometimes 4 round trips a week depending on the season. That road takes you up through Laramie, climbs you up over Elk Mountain around Arlington, drops you down past Walcott Junction, and from there it's Rawlins, Rock Springs, Green River, Evanston, and into Utah. Anybody who's run that lane in the winter knows Elk Mountain isn't a joke. Wyoming doesn't need snow to shut that road down. All it needs is wind, and Wyoming's never been short on wind. They call it a ground blizzard. Clear sky, hardly a flake falling, and the wind just picks up everything that's already on the ground and throws it sideways until you can't see your own headlights bounce off the guardrail 3 feet away. WYDOT closes the gates at Arlington a dozen times a season for exactly that reason, and every driver on that road has sat behind those gates at some point, waiting for the state to open it back up. My dad drove that same stretch, years before me, back when I was a kid. He ran for a small outfit out of Cheyenne, and one January night when I was 11, he didn't come home. They found his tractor about 4 days later, buried in a drift off the shoulder near Arlington, cab crushed against a barrier, nobody inside. No body. They chalked it up to him getting out to look for help and going down into the draw below the road, where the snow was deep enough to swallow a man whole and never give him back. They searched that spring when the snow melted and never found anything. My mother kept his old CB handle written on a card, taped inside a kitchen drawer for years. Long Rider. That was what he went by. Like maybe someday somebody'd radio in with information, and she'd need to remember what to listen for. I grew up knowing that road took my father, and never told anybody where. So when I say I know that stretch, I mean I know it in a way that sits heavier on me than it does on most drivers. And I want you to understand that up until that night, nothing about running Elk Mountain in a storm scared me. It was routine, frustrating, sometimes miserable, but routine. That night started like any other closure night. I left Cheyenne a little after 6 in the evening, with a load bound for a distribution center outside Salt Lake, and the forecast had a storm system rolling in off the divide, the kind that gets upgraded from a winter weather advisory to a warning by the time you're halfway to Laramie. By the time I hit the base of the climb toward Arlington, the wind had already picked up enough that my trailer was getting pushed around in the gusts, and I could see brake lights strung out ahead of me on the grade, a whole line of them, maybe a dozen trucks or more, all slowed to a crawl, and then stopped dead. I figured YDOT had dropped the gate up top, which they had. I confirmed it on the 511 app before my signal went to nothing, and I settled in behind the last set of taillights to wait it out, same as I'd done probably 30 times before in my career. The storm got worse fast. Within an hour, I couldn't see the cab of the truck directly in front of me, except as a smear of red brake light through snow that wasn't so much falling as flying sideways, parallel to the ground, driven by wind that rocked my whole rig on its springs. I killed some time on the CB, Channel 19, the way you do when you're stuck, just to hear another voice and get a read on how bad it was further up the line. A driver came back on, identified himself by handle rather than a company name, something like Little Elkhorn, said he was maybe 8-9 trucks up from the gate, said the wind was worse where he was sitting, said we might be here a while. Nothing strange about any of that on its own. Truckers use handles all the time, especially the older guys who came up on CB radio before everybody had a cell phone in the cab. What got me, and what I didn't let myself think too hard about at the time, because I was cold and tired and wanted to believe the storm would break, was that Little Elkhorn wasn't a handle I'd have expected from somebody driving today. It was old-fashioned. It was the kind of handle guys used back when my dad drove, and there was something about the way he talked, slow, easy, like he had nowhere else in the world to be, that put a small, cold stone in my stomach I chose to ignore. We talked on and off for a couple hours, him and me, mostly just killing time, him telling me about a closure years back that had stretched 2 full days, me half listening, half watching the wall of white in my headlights and the smudge of his taillights, or what I assumed were his taillights, glowing up ahead through the snow. Every so often I'd flash my brights when the line crept forward a few feet, and every so often the lights ahead of me would do the same, like the whole convoy was breathing together, inching up the mountain in tiny increments, while the state waited for a break in the wind to reopen the gate. 6 hours of that, 6 hours of brake lights and static, and Little Elkhorn's slow voice telling me it wouldn't be long now. Then, sometime close to 5 in the morning, the wind just stopped. Not gradually, all at once, the way it sometimes does out there, like a door closing. The snow settled. The sky went that flat gray that comes right before first light, and for the first time in 6 hours, I could actually see the road stretching out in front of me. There was nothing on it. No trucks, no taillights, no convoy of a dozen rigs creeping up the grade, just 2 empty lanes of blacktop dusted with snow, curving up toward the summit and disappearing into the gray, as far as my headlights and the coming daylight would let me see. I sat there for a good minute, just running my eyes over that empty road, waiting for my brain to make sense of it, waiting for the shapes to resolve into trucks, the way your eyes adjust to a dark room. They never did. There weren't any trucks to resolve into. I got out of my cab, and this is the part that still sits wrong with me every time I tell it. There should have been tire tracks. A dozen trucks don't idle in place for 6 hours without leaving a mess of packed, churned snow and diesel exhaust stains all up and down that grade. My own truck had that exact mess around it, snow packed brown and gray from my tires and my exhaust, footprints where I'd walked around to check my chains twice during the night. And ahead of me, where I'd been staring at brake lights for 6 straight hours, the snow lay clean, not undisturbed in the sense of freshly fallen and pretty, undisturbed in the sense that nothing had been there at all. No tire ruts, no footprints, no exhaust stains. The wind had been blowing hard enough all night to scour the surface, sure, but it hadn't touched the snow immediately around my own truck, and it should have hit the trucks ahead of me exactly the same way it hit mine. I got back in my cab and keyed the mic and called for Little Elkhorn. Nothing came back but the hiss of an open channel. I told myself the wind had done something, some trick of the ground blizzard scouring tracks clean, while somehow sparing the ground right under my own tires, because of how my trailer blocked the gusts, and I drove the rest of that day rattled but functioning, telling myself a story I could live with. It wasn't until I called it in that the story stopped holding together. I called my dispatcher first, just to log the delay, and then, because something in me needed it confirmed by somebody official, I called YDOT's road information line and got transferred to a duty officer who pulled the closure log for that stretch. She told me the gate at Arlington had indeed been down that night, closed at 9:40 p.m., reopened at 5:15 a.m., matching my own experience almost to the minute. But when I asked her how many vehicles had been stacked up behind the closure, she went quiet for a second and told me the automated traffic counter at the closure point showed one vehicle, mine. She checked it twice, thinking it was a malfunction, and pulled the weigh station data from Walcott Junction downhill. The checkpoint every one of those trucks would have had to pass once the gate lifted, since there's no other way off that mountain. Nothing came through Walcott that morning until I did, 40 minutes after the gate opened, alone. I didn't let that go. I couldn't. I spent the next few weeks pulling at that thread on my days off, first through old newspaper archives at the library in Cheyenne, then through a retired dispatcher named Earl, who'd worked freight out of that same terminal for almost 40 years, and who remembered, without me prompting him, a bad string of winters back in the 80s, when Elk Mountain took more than one truck and driver, in storms that came up faster than anybody could react to. Earl was the one who told me, without knowing why I was asking, that one of those drivers used to run CB Handle Little Elkhorn. He said it slow, the way you say a name you haven't said out loud in years. And he said the man's rig went into a whiteout on that grade 1 January night and was found 4 days later off the shoulder near Arlington. Cab crushed. Driver never recovered. I didn't tell Earl that was my father. I didn't tell him Little Elkhorn was the handle my mother kept written on a card in a kitchen drawer for 20 years. I just thanked him and hung up and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time. I still run that lane. Cheyenne to Salt Lake, same as always, because it's the only work I know, and because somebody's got to haul the freight, storm or no storm. But when the weather turns bad, around Arlington now, when the gate drops, and I find myself sitting in the dark, waiting out a closure, with nothing ahead of me but my own headlights and the wind, I still pick up the mic sometimes, and I still key it down, and I still say the name into the static, half hoping and half afraid that somewhere up that grade, in a storm just like the one that took him, my father keys his mic back and answers me. The man got up into my cab, and before the door even latched, he said, "Load 4471 turbine blade, Sweetwater Substation, ETA 0240. I hadn't told him my name. I sure as hell hadn't told him that. Let me back up, because that line doesn't mean anything if you don't know what the job looks like. I've been driving flatbeds 6 years, the last 3 of it hauling oversize. Wind turbine blades mostly, the kind that stretch 150 feet behind you and need a pilot car running ahead with an amber light bar and a sign that says what you already know from looking at it. You get a route packet the night before, a load number, a drop time. None of it goes out over open radio, and none of it gets posted anywhere a stranger could read it, because half the reason for the escort is that these blades are worth more than some houses, and the company doesn't want randoms knowing where a 100-foot piece of fiberglass is going to be sitting on a dark highway. That night, I was running US 287 between Rawlins and Lander, which is about as much nothing as Wyoming has to offer, and Wyoming has a lot of nothing to offer. Late September. Dusk sliding into full dark by the time I hit Muddy Gap. Clear sky. Cold enough that my breath was fogging even with the heater running. Denny was up ahead in the pilot car. Guy I've worked with on and off for 4 years. Steady hands. Doesn't rattle easy. The blade behind me was wrapped in white canvas, strapped down like something asleep, and every time a gust caught it, the whole trailer would lean a half degree and settle back. I don't pick up hitchhikers. 6 years on the road, you learn that rule fast, and you don't break it. Not with a 100-foot load and a company policy that'll fire you for it. But there's a stretch past Jeffrey City where the shoulder's wide and flat, and I saw a guy standing there, not walking, just standing, facing the road, hands in his jacket pockets, like he was waiting for a bus that hadn't run in 50 years. Something about a man just standing still on empty highway at dusk makes you slow down whether you mean to or not. I told myself I was slowing down because of the wind gust warning sign. I wasn't. I stopped. He walked up unhurried, climbed into the cab, and said the number before his door shut. I laughed it off first. That's the honest truth. I laughed, because the alternative was believing something I didn't want to believe, And dispatcher's kids ride along sometimes. And maybe he'd heard it on a scanner. Maybe a lot of things. I asked him straight out how he knew my load number, and he just looked out the windshield and said, "You always leave the dome light off past Muddy Gap. Habit from your dad, right? Said it ruins your night eyes." And that one landed different, because that's not a thing you say to a scanner. That's not a thing that's written anywhere. My father taught me that in a Peterbilt in 1997, and he's been dead 9 years, and I have never told a living soul where the habit came from. I didn't say anything for a couple miles. I just drove, hands too tight on the wheel, watching him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't look dangerous. Didn't look like anything, really. Flannel, canvas jacket, the kind of face you'd forget in a grocery store line. He asked for the heat up a notch, and I gave it to him without thinking, the way you do things on autopilot when your brain's stuck on a loop. Somewhere past Sweetwater Station, I keyed the CB to check in with Denny, mostly because I needed to hear another human voice that wasn't sitting 6 inches from my shoulder. "Denny, you got me," I said. "Picked up a hitchhiker back at Jeffrey City. Heads up." There was a pause, longer than radio lag should account for, and then Denny came back, sounding like he was choosing his words around something. "Say again. You picked up a who? I've had eyes on your cab in my mirror for the last 40 minutes, and I didn't see you stop." "Didn't see anybody get in," I told him again, plain as I could, and I watched the man beside me the whole time I said it, and he just watched the road, calm, like none of this concerned him. Denny went quiet again, and when he came back, his voice had changed. "What's he look like?" I described him. Average build, jacket, maybe 50. Quiet voice. There was static. Then Denny said, "That's not funny, man." I told him I wasn't joking. He said, "You know who hauled blades on this stretch before you did? Kurt Halverson. 19 years with the company. Lost the escort in a whiteout up by the Beaver Rim Overlook back in 2018. Went off the shoulder with a blade still strapped down. They didn't find the truck till the next afternoon." Then, quieter. "That's exactly what Kurt looked like." I didn't say anything back. I looked over, and the man was still there, hands folded in his lap. And for the first time since he'd gotten in, he turned his head and looked at me. Not menacing, nothing like that. Just tired, the way a man looks after a long shift. And he said, "Almost there," and went back to watching the windshield. Like the conversation was closed. We came up on the substation a little after 2 in the morning, floodlights and a ground crew waiting with flags, and I eased the rig off onto the gravel and set the brake, and turned to tell him we'd made it. The passenger seat was empty, door shut, latched, exactly the way it had been the whole ride. No sound of it opening. No cold gust of outside air that you'd get if a door had cracked at highway speed, or even standing still. Just an empty seat and a jacket-shaped nothing, where a man had been sitting 2 seconds before. I got out with my flashlight shaking a little more than I'd have liked to admit, and walked around the truck. There were footprints in the frost on the shoulder, small crystals of it starting to form on the gravel edge, and they came up from somewhere out in the dark, clean and even, right up to the passenger door. I followed them back with the flashlight. 20 yards, 50, 100, out past where the ground crew's lights stopped reaching. They just went on in a straight line into the sagebrush, and then, near as I could tell, they stopped. Not faded, not scattered like a man had turned and walked off in a different direction. Stopped, mid-stride, like someone had picked their foot up and never put it back down. There was nothing coming back the other way. Nothing leading anywhere except toward my truck. One of the ground crew guys asked if I was all right, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost, and laughed at his own joke. And I laughed too because it was that, or start explaining, and I wasn't ready to explain anything to anybody yet. I got back in the cab to log the delivery, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking long enough to write, so I called dispatch instead. Told the night guy, Ray, been there longer than I have, that I wanted to confirm the load number and pickup time for my paperwork, just to hear a normal voice read normal numbers back at me. He pulled it up and read it off. 4471, Sweetwater Substation. Then he said, created at 9:52. Tonight, you logged pickup at 7:15. That check out? I told him that didn't make sense. that the man in my truck had said that number to me at 7:15, word for word, before I'd even seen my own paperwork for the night. Ray went quiet on his end, and I heard him clicking through something, and when he came back, his voice had dropped. 44, 71, wasn't a scheduled load, man. It's a reassignment. Original haul got pulled off a truck that rolled near Muddy Gap around 7:30 tonight. Driver's fine. Walked away. But the blade needed a new carrier, and dispatch cut you a fresh number and routed you onto it after the fact. That's why it didn't exist in the system till almost 10. You weren't ever supposed to be on that load. You were supposed to be running empty back to the yard on the old highway, same road, 20 minutes behind that truck. I sat there in the cab a long time after he hung up, engine ticking as it cooled, ground crew guys packing up their lights around me, and I looked over at the empty passenger seat one more time. There was a thin patch of frost on the vinyl, right where a man's jacket would have pressed against it, already starting to bead into water in the warm cab air, and I watched it disappear before I could bring myself to touch it. The first time I heard my own voice come over Channel 19, I was still about 90 seconds from finding out it was telling the truth. 22 years I've been hauling fuel, most of it at night, most of it alone in a cab, with 80,000 pounds of unleaded riding behind me, trying to decide whether it wants to go the same direction I do. Rock Springs to Rollins is the run I know best, 100 miles of Interstate 80 that cuts through some of the emptiest, meanest country in Wyoming. And if you've never driven it after dark in the winter, count yourself lucky. There's a stretch around Wamsutter where the land opens up flat and the wind gets a running start for 40 miles before it ever reaches your trailer. And when it hits like something with intention. That's the stretch this happened on. That's the stretch I still think about more than I'd like to admit. That night, the Wyoming Department of Transportation had the whole corridor under a high wind warning, gusts near 60. Some reports saying higher out past the Wamsutter exit. I had a half load, which is worse than a full one in that kind of wind, because a half-full tank sloshes, and a sloshing tank pushes back against you at the worst possible second. I don't usually run Channel 19. Most nights it's nothing but noise. Guys complaining about way stations or telling jokes that were old when I started driving. And somewhere along the way, I got out of the habit of listening. But on a wind advisory night, you keep it on, because that's how you hear about a jackknife trailer or a closure before you're on top of it. So the radio was up. That's the only reason I was listening at all. Somewhere past the Wamsutter exit, the static broke, and a voice came through. Calm, almost bored, the way you talk when you're just passing the time on a long straightaway. It took me a few seconds to place what was wrong with it, because at first it just sounded like company. Then it sounded like somebody doing an impression of me. Then it stopped sounding like an impression at all, because the cadence was mine. The little pause I put before I say a mile marker was mine. Even the way I clear my throat before I finish a sentence was mine. The voice said there was a silver car stalled up ahead past marker 173, pulled half onto the shoulder, hazards not working, driver out, and pacing near the guardrail. I sat with that for a second, the way you sit with something that doesn't fit anywhere in your head. My first thought, the only thought that made any sense, was that somebody had recorded me running my mouth on this same stretch some other night and was playing it back to get a rise out of me. Truckers do that. It wouldn't have been the first prank pulled on Channel 19, and it wouldn't have been the meanest one either. I keyed the mic and said something like, "Real funny, who is this?" and got nothing back but the hiss between transmissions. I told myself that was that. I told myself a lot of things in the next few minutes that turned out not to hold up. Marker 173 came up in my headlights, and there it was. Silver car, half on the shoulder, hazards dark instead of blinking, and a shape of a person walking a tight little circle near the guardrail, with their arms wrapped around themselves against the wind. Every detail sitting exactly where the voice had put it, down to things a recording from some other night never could have known. Because I could see now, the car had a cracked windshield on the passenger side, and a temporary tag taped inside the back glass, the kind you get from a dealership when you've just bought something used. There was no way to have known that ahead of time. There was no way to have known any of it ahead of time. I slowed down enough to make sure the driver waved that they were fine, radioed the highway patrol their location, and kept going. Because in a wind like that, you don't stop unless you have to. And because if I'm honest, some part of me didn't want to be standing still on that stretch of road, with whatever had just happened still happening. I hailed Channel 19 again, once I'd put some miles between me and that car. Asked straight out who was broadcasting, told them it wasn't funny anymore. Dead air. I ran through every other channel I knew, thinking maybe I'd catch somebody snickering about it, somebody who'd own up. Nothing but the ordinary chatter you'd expect on any other night. None of it about me. None of it about a silver car. Whoever or whatever had been on Channel 19 wasn't talking to anyone but me, and it wasn't talking anymore at all. It was somewhere in those quiet miles after, trying to talk myself back down, that a detail caught up with me I hadn't let myself look at straight on. The way that driver had been pacing, arms wrapped tight, head down against the wind. I'd seen that exact posture before, on this exact stretch, 16 years back, the night I lost a kid named Danny, who I'd spent 4 months training to drive a rig of his own. He was solo for the first time that night, a few miles ahead of me on this same road under a wind advisory not much different from this one, and I remember getting a burst of noise on Channel 19 right around the time he would have been passing through here. Something I couldn't make out, garbled enough that I chalked it up to the wind messing with the signal and didn't think another thing of it. 20 minutes later, dispatch was calling me to ask if I'd heard from him, because he'd stopped answering, and by the time anybody reached him, his rig was already off the shoulder and down the embankment. I never told anyone about that burst of noise. I didn't have anything real to tell, but I stopped running Channel 19 after that, and until that wind advisory forced my hand, I hadn't turned it back on in 16 years. I don't scare easy. Not after this long on the road, but sitting there putting those 2 nights next to each other, something in my chest went cold and stayed there. I keyed the mic one more time, and this time I didn't ask who it was. I said Danny's name into it, quiet, more to myself than to anybody, just to see what would happen. What happened was, the voice came back, my own voice again, and it didn't ask what I meant. It repeated back to me, word for word, the last thing I ever said to that kid over the radio, a stupid little joke about buying him a coffee in Rollins that I have never once said out loud to another living soul in 16 years. Nobody had that. Nobody could have had that. A recording explains an impression of my voice. It does not explain the inside of my own head being read back to me on a frequency I hadn't touched in 16 years. That's when the shape of the whole thing turned over on me. I'd been thinking about the silver car like it was a stranger's trouble I'd been warned about and driven past. Done and finished. But sitting with Danny's name still hanging in the cab, I understood I had the direction wrong. The voice hadn't been warning me about somebody up ahead of me. It had been walking me through the same stretch of road, mile marker by mile marker, at the same pace I was driving it. The way you'd walk somebody back through something that already happened, to make them see what they missed. I wasn't approaching a stranger's bad luck. I was retracing Danny's last 20 minutes, almost to the mile, on the one night in 16 years I'd had any reason to be back on this road under these conditions, because the driver who normally ran this route had called in sick, and dispatch needed somebody who knew it. I had that thought fully formed in my head, and no more than a few seconds later, right around the same stretch where I used to picture that embankment in my sleep, a gust came off the flats and caught the trailer broadside, hard enough that I felt the whole rig lean before I felt myself react. Half a load doesn't sit still in a hit like that. It swings, and I was already halfway turned toward the radio instead of squared up on the wheel, trying to make sense of what I'd just understood, instead of watching the road the way 16 years should have trained me to. The back end came around. I heard the rumble strip under the drive tires, felt the whole rig start to lean toward a roll, before I got enough countersteer into it to bring it back, and for about 4 seconds, that felt considerably longer. I genuinely did not know which way this was going to end. It came back. I got it slowed, and stopped on the shoulder, shaking hard enough that I had to sit there with both hands on the wheel, just to keep them still. When I could finally make myself pick up the mic and check in with dispatch, Channel 19 was just static, the plain ordinary kind, like nothing had ever come through it at all. I sat on that shoulder a long time before I trusted myself to pull back onto the road. I made Rollins that morning in one piece, turned in my log, and the first thing I did once I was home was pull the CB out of the dash and leave it sitting in a drawer for longer than I want to say. I never did learn what that voice was, or why it chose that night to come find me, or whether it was trying to warn me, or just trying to make me feel, one more time, exactly what it had felt like to lose him. Some things you stop trying to explain and just carry instead. That was 16 years ago now, which puts it almost dead even with how long I'd already been driving when it happened, and Channel 19 has sat dark in every cab I've run since. I don't touch it. I don't miss it. Dispatch knows better than to ask why. Last week, they put the whole corridor under another wind advisory, the worst one since that year, and shorthanded the way they always are. They called me for the Rock Springs to Rollins run. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I've told myself that before. Somewhere past the Wamsutter exit, with the wind already leaning on the trailer and the dark pressing flat against the windshield, I felt my hand leave the wheel and drift toward the radio on its own, like it remembered something my head hadn't agreed to yet. I watched my own fingers turn the dial to 19, and under the hiss, low and unhurried, right on the edge of clear, I heard myself starting to speak. 4 years I've been running livestock, ranch to processing, mostly, the runs nobody wants, because they're long, and they pay the same as the short ones. You learn things doing that job that they don't put in the training video. You learn what a trailer sounds like when it's loaded right, when the weight's balanced and the cattle have settled into the sway of the highway. You learn the difference between a scared ball and a bored one. 4 years, and I thought I knew every sound 30 head of cattle could make in a steel box behind my truck. That night proved me wrong. I was hauling a load out of a ranch outside Shoshone. 24 head, heifers mostly, bound for a processing plant down past Thermopolis. The route runs you straight through Wind River Canyon, that stretch of 26 where the road gets pinched between the rock wall and the river, and there's nothing else out there but you, the water, and whatever's using the canyon as a wind tunnel that day. I'd run it maybe 60, 70 times. Never thought twice about it. It was just miles. It was early spring, that time of year when the snow melts coming down off the mountains, and the river's running high and cold, and the fog comes up off the water right around dusk like the canyon's exhaling. I'd seen that fog plenty. I liked it, actually. Made the drive feel private. About 4 miles in, past the second tunnel, the cattle started making a sound I'd never heard cattle make. It wasn't the bawling you get when they're stressed, and it wasn't the low moan of a sick animal. It was almost rhythmic, like they were all doing it at once, in time with each other. A kind of long, groaning hum that came up through the floor of the cab and into my chest before I even really registered it as sound. I actually looked down at my dash, thinking something was wrong with the truck, some belt or bearing singing at me. Then it dropped off just as sudden as it started, and the quiet after was worse than the noise had been. I pulled onto the shoulder where the canyon opens up a little, right by an old pull-off the fishermen use in summer, and I climbed down to check on them. First thing I noticed, before I even got the flashlight up, was that they'd all bunched to one side of the trailer, not spread out the way cattle spread out when they're riding easy. Pressed, shoulder to shoulder, every one of them pushed against the wall on the riverside, and every single head turned to face the same direction, away from the canyon, staring back the way we'd come, like they were watching for something on the road behind us. I've hauled a lot of spooked cattle, thunderstorms, gunshots, dogs running loose near a chute. I know what a herd looks like when something's got them rattled, and this wasn't that, exactly. There was no shoving, no kicking at the rails. They were just still, pressed and still, and facing one way, and none of them would look at me when I put the light on them. I did what you do. I counted heads, out of habit more than worry. 23. I counted again, slower, tapping each rump with my hand the way I do when the light's bad. 23. My paperwork said 24. Now, losing a head off a trailer isn't unheard of, but it usually means a gate came open somewhere, and my gate was latched, chain looped through it the way I always do it, hadn't budged. I checked the floor for blood, for a break in the siding, anything that would tell me one of them had gone down and gotten trampled into a corner where I couldn't see her. Nothing. just 23 head of cattle, tight against one wall, refusing to turn their heads toward the water. I counted a third time, because that's what you do when a number won't sit right in your head. 25. I stood there in the fog, with my flashlight going numb in my hand, and told myself I'd miscounted the first time, that the light was bad, that heifers this age all look alike in the dark, and I was probably double-tapping the same rump twice. That's the story I told myself, because the alternative was standing on a lonely stretch of highway believing my count of the same 20 feet of trailer had changed twice in 10 minutes. That was when I noticed her, second from the front, tucked in tight against the others, and she didn't match. Every other animal on that trailer had a yellow tag through the left ear. Ranch's brand, standard stuff. This one didn't have a tag at all. Her coat was caked with dry mud up the flank, cracked and gray, the kind of mud you get from standing in a dry wash, not the wet spring mud everywhere else on that truck. It hadn't rained in that country in 4 days, but every other animal on my trailer was slicked with fresh mud from the loading pen that morning. Hers was old, and when I ran the light across her face, her eyes threw it back at me wrong. Not the green shine you get off a cow's eye at night. Hers came back flat and colorless, like 2 coins. I got back in the cab quicker than I want to admit and got on the CB, mostly just wanting to hear another voice. Caught a trucker heading the opposite way, southbound, and asked him straight out if he'd ever had cattle spook bad running that canyon at dusk. There was a pause longer than radio lag accounts for, and then he came back and told me his uncle used to run that same stretch for 30 years and wouldn't do it after dark anymore, not for any money, and that the old man never would say exactly why, just that you don't stop to recount anything in that canyon. Once the fog's up, you drive it straight through, and you don't look at what's looking back at you from the rail. I asked him what that meant, and he didn't answer, just told me to get on down the road, and the radio went back to static. I checked my dash clock before I pulled back onto the highway. It read 7:52. I remember that clearly, because I remember thinking I'd make good time still. Plenty of daylight left in the gray behind the fog. When I came out the far end of the canyon, past the last tunnel where the walls finally open up, and you can see the valley lights strung out ahead of you, I checked it again out of habit. 9:41, 4 miles of highway. Should have taken me 6-7 minutes at the speed I was running. I sat at that stop sign at the junction for a solid minute doing the math over and over. Sure, I'd misread it the first time, and I hadn't. I decided, somewhere in that long, straight stretch before Thermopolis, that when I got to the plant, I was going to pull that untagged heifer off before she got processed with the rest. Because whatever she wasn't my rancher's animal, and I didn't want my name on the paperwork for a head that wasn't mine to deliver. I got the yard lights of the plant in my mirrors, pulled into the chute lane, and climbed back to swing the rear gate before the crew got to it, wanting one more look at her before I explained myself to anybody. She wasn't there. I want to be clear that the gate hadn't been touched. My chain was exactly where I'd left it, looped and clipped, no play in it at all. 23 heads stood in that trailer, same as my second count in the canyon, same tags, same mud, nothing out of place, except that the one animal that didn't belong wasn't standing among them anymore, and there was no way out of that box that I hadn't personally locked from the outside. The receiving hand ran my numbers against the manifest while I stood there with my mouth dry, and he looked up at me and said, casual as anything, that I was one short, 23 against 24, and did I want to note it or eat the difference myself. I asked him if that happened much, short counts, on loads coming through the canyon specifically. He didn't even look up from his clipboard. Said it happens enough on that route that some of the older haulers just build it into their math before they leave the ranch, and left it at that, like it was a pothole everybody knew about and nobody bothered reporting. I ate the difference, told the rancher I'd lost one, paid it out of my own pocket, rather than argue a story nobody was going to believe, and drove home that night, with both hands tight on the wheel, and every mirror lit up in my head, even after I'd parked the rig. It was a week later, going back through my old delivery logs for something unrelated, mileage for taxes, that I found it. 3 other runs through that same canyon, going back almost 2 years, where my final count at the plant didn't match my count at loading. Not by much. 1 head. Twice. Never flagged it, never thought about it. Just chalked each one up to a bad tally on a long day, same as anybody would. 3 times before I ever noticed the sound. 3 times I drove that canyon at dusk with something riding along in the dark behind the others, and I never once looked hard enough to catch it. I still run that route. Company needs me to, but I don't run it at dusk anymore. Not for any load, not for any money. And if the sun's going down, when I hit the mouth of that canyon, I sit in a gas station lot in Shoshone until it's full dark or full light, because at least then, I know what I'm counting. I've never gotten the numbers to match again on an evening run through there. Not once. And I've stopped trying to figure out what that missing head, or that extra one, actually is. I just know she's out there somewhere between the loading and the scale, riding quiet in the fog. And some nights I think about all those trips before I ever noticed. And I wonder how many times she rode with me and got off clean before I ever thought to count twice. I've been driving trucks for 12 years now, mostly reefer work, hauling lettuce and stone fruit and whatever else needs to stay cold between the Central Valley and Denver. The southern route takes me across Wyoming on I-80, through Rock Springs and Green River, and up over the summit before it drops toward Cheyenne. I've made that run probably 400 times. I know where the wind hits the trailer broadside outside Rawlins. I know which rest areas have working showers. I know the exact mile marker where my radio starts picking up a country station out of Rock Springs before it fades again 20 minutes later. That kind of familiarity does something to a man. You stop seeing the road. You just feel it under you, and your body drives while your head goes somewhere else. It was the middle of July, past 2 in the morning, and the sky out there was doing what it does in the high desert when there's no moon and no clouds, just absolutely packed with stars, more than you'd believe, unless you'd seen it yourself. No traffic. I hadn't passed another set of headlights in 20 minutes. The reefer unit was humming behind me, the way it always does, and I had the window cracked because the night air out there, even in summer, comes in cold and dry, and it keeps you sharp. I was somewhere past mile marker 99, that long straight stretch before the road bends toward the river, when I saw her. She was standing dead center in my lane, not on the shoulder, not near the shoulder, in the lane, facing me, arms down at her sides, like she'd been standing there a while, and had simply decided this was where she'd wait. I had maybe 2 seconds. I laid on the horn and cut the wheel right. And 62,000 pounds of truck and trailer does not want to do that at 70 miles an hour. The trailer came around on me. I felt the drive tires lose their bite. Felt that sick, weightless half second where you know you might be rolling it. And I fought the wheel back the other way, downshifting, praying, and somehow the rig straightened out, and I got it stopped on the shoulder, with the trailer jackknifed hard against the tractor, and gravel dust still hanging in my headlights. I sat there with both hands locked on the wheel, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Then I grabbed the flashlight from under the seat and got out. Because in that job, when you swerve like that, you get out. You check. You brace yourself for the worst thing a man can see on the side of a highway. Because there is no version of that swerve where you tell yourself it was nothing until you've looked. There was nothing. No body, no blood, nothing in the sagebrush along the shoulder. Nothing under the trailer, nothing on the tires. I walked the whole length of the rig twice with that flashlight, and the road was as empty as it had been before I ever saw her. I was already building the story I'd tell myself. 12 years, running on no sleep. The mind plays tricks. Everybody who drives nights long enough sees something eventually. When the light passed over the side of the trailer and caught something that stopped that story cold, there were handprints scraped into the paint. Small ones. A child's hands, by the size of them, pressed and dragged into the aluminum skin of the trailer, high up near the top rail, a good 6 feet off the ground, higher than any child could reach standing on the ground beside a moving truck, higher than most grown men could reach without jumping. 4 sets, maybe 5, layered over each other like something had been clawing to hold on. I didn't sleep the rest of that run. I got the trailer unjackknifed, got back on the road, and drove into Green River, telling myself I'd get it looked at, get it buffed out, forget about it. What actually happened was I sat in a truck stop parking lot outside Rock Springs 2 nights later. Cargo delivered, deadhead run back toward Cheyenne, and I pulled the SD card out of my dash cam. I told myself I was doing it to prove there was nothing there. Trucks like mine run forward and rear cameras now, mostly for insurance, mostly so some four-wheeler can't total your career with a fake whiplash claim. I scrubbed back to the timestamp, and there she was. One frame, just one, out of 30 a second, standing in the lane exactly where I remembered her, and then the next frame the lane was empty. No blur, no motion streak, the way you'd get if a person had dropped and rolled clear or bolted for the ditch. She was there, and then the record simply skipped past her, like she'd never been standing on that asphalt at all. I watched that clip maybe 40 times. I wanted it to be a trick of the headlights, a reflection, a bug on the lens. It wasn't. Whatever I swerved around, it existed long enough for a camera that doesn't get scared and doesn't run on adrenaline to catch it too. I didn't tell anybody for a while. Then, at a counter in Little America, I ended up next to an older guy. Gray beard, company patches from 30 years of different outfits, and something about being that tired made me just say it out loud, half expecting him to laugh at me. He didn't laugh. He put his coffee down and asked me exactly where on the 99 to 101 stretch it happened, like he already had a mile marker in mind before I gave him one. Turned out he did. He said he'd heard it from at least 3 other drivers over the years. Always that same short piece of straight road. Always late. Always a woman standing in the lane who wasn't there once you stopped. He said one guy he used to run with didn't swerve. Figured it was a mirage. Kept the wheel straight and drove his rig into a stalled cattle truck that had lost its lights 200 yards further on. Didn't survive it. The old guy said after that, word got around among the ones who worked that route regular, and most of them just made peace with the fact that if you saw her, you swerved, and you didn't ask questions. I couldn't leave it alone after that. On my next few days off, I went digging. First through the newspaper archive at the library in Rock Springs, then through some old accident records a trooper I'd gotten friendly with over the years was willing to pull for me off the book. What I found was a hit and run from decades back, right around that same stretch, during a whiteout in late winter. A woman's car had gone off the shoulder in the storm. She'd gotten out to flag down help and was struck by a semi that never stopped. Never got identified. Driver either didn't feel it or didn't want to know what he'd felt. The woman died at the scene. Her daughter, 4 years old, had been in the car. By the time anyone found the wreck the next morning, the girl had made her way out onto the road herself. And the working theory, never proven, was that she'd tried to catch up to the truck that hit her mother, tried to grab hold of something that was already gone. I read that sitting in my own cab with the dome light on, and something about it settled into my chest like a stone. I thought about those handprints, 6 feet up a trailer wall, way higher than a 4-year-old could reach, standing flat-footed on the ground. And I understood, in a way I didn't want to, exactly what kind of reaching that would take. What broke something open in me, though, wasn't the old newspaper story. It was my own mother, on the phone a week later, when I made the mistake of mentioning Green River in passing, just testing the water, seeing if the name meant anything to her. She went quiet, in a way that told me everything, before she said a word. My father drove for 22 years before he quit trucking altogether, when I was a boy, and he never once explained why. Never talked about the job again. Wouldn't even ride in a cab if I offered him a lift later in life. My mother told me, carefully, like she was setting down something she'd been carrying a long time, that the year he quit, he'd been running a route through southern Wyoming for a produce outfit out of Sacramento. She didn't know anything more than that, or she wasn't willing to say it if she did. But I knew the truck he'd driven, because I was driving it. He'd kept the tractor after he left the company, had it repainted twice over the years, sold the original trailer, but kept buying the same style, same brand, right up until he passed it down to me when I got my CDL. I sat there holding the phone and doing math I didn't want to do, lining up a year against a year, and I couldn't make myself finish it out loud to her. I thought about parking the rig for good. I thought about it seriously. Sat in a lot outside Cheyenne for the better part of a day turning it over. But there's no living in this business if you won't run your route. and there's a mortgage that doesn't care what you saw on the highway. So a week later, I was back on I-80 westbound at 2 in the morning, coming up on mile marker 99, with my hands sweating on the wheel for the first time in 12 years of driving that road. She was there again. Same spot, same stillness, same 2 seconds before I had to decide. I swerved the same way I had the first time, felt the trailer buck and slide, fought it straight, and that's when my headlights swept across what was waiting another 100 yards up the lane I would have been in. A rolled horse trailer, half on the shoulder and half across my lane. No flares out yet, no lights working. A stalled pickup behind it, with its hazards barely blinking through a busted taillight. If I'd held my line the way training tells you to hold your line when you think you're seeing things, I'd have driven straight into the wreckage at highway speed, with no time left to brake. I got that rig stopped, got out, helped drag a shaken kid out of the horse trailer's cab before the state patrol showed up, and somewhere in the adrenaline of all that, I understood something I hadn't let myself consider before. Whatever steps into that lane out there isn't hunting truckers. It's still reaching for one, the same way it always has, the only way it knows how, and every driver who's ever swerved because of her has come out the other side of that curve alive. I didn't tell the troopers about any of it. I gave my statement about the horse trailer and left the rest out, because there's no box on that form for what I actually swerved around first. When the wreck was cleared and I was back on the road, I drove straight through to a truck wash outside Cheyenne and paid to have the whole trailer scrubbed down, top to bottom. Told the kid running the wand there was some kind of residue on the paint I wanted gone. He did a full pass. I checked it after under the yard lights, and the handprints were still there, same as before, like the water had gone straight through them without touching a thing. I had it washed again 2 days later at a different place, a full service bay this time. Paid extra for the hand detail, so nobody could tell me it was a machine that missed a spot. I stood there and watched a man scrub that section of paint myself until his arm was tired. When he finished and stepped back, the marks were exactly where they'd always been. Small fingers dragged into the metal 6 feet off the ground, like they'd been pressed into the trailer from the inside of the paint itself, rather than the surface of it. 2 washes, 2 different shops, and they never once faded. I still run that stretch of road. I still see her some nights, not every run, but enough that I've stopped pretending it's fatigue. I swerve every time, and every time I get back into the cab afterward, I look at those prints in my side mirror before I pull off the shoulder, and I think about a woman who never got flagged down in time, and a little girl who's been reaching for the back of a truck on that same stretch of highway for longer than I've been alive, still trying, every single night, to catch hold of the one that got away from her. I've been driving a dry van for 15 years now, most of it hauling LTL freight, less than truckload, mixed pallets going out to a string of different consignés on one run, instead of a single load to a single dock. For the last 6 of those years, my main lane has been US 191, between Pinedale and Rock Springs, Wyoming, with pickups and drops strung along the way through Boulder, Big Piney, Marbleton, Farson. It's not a glamorous run, it's a lonely one. Most nights in winter, I might pass 4 or 5 vehicles total on that stretch, and half of those turn off onto a ranch road before I've even got them settled in my mirrors. The night I want to tell you about started like any other run, in late January. Clear sky, hard cold, the kind where your own exhaust freezes into a fog that just hangs behind the trailer instead of drifting off. We'd gotten about 4 inches of fresh snow 2 days earlier, packed down on the shoulders, and 191 was plowed but glazed over in spots where the wind had pushed drift back across the lanes. I'd started in Pinedale a little after 4 that afternoon, worked my pickups, and by the time I hit the long straight south of Boulder, it was full dark, maybe 6:30. That's when I noticed the headlights sitting about a quarter mile back. Nothing strange about that on its own. What got my attention was that they stayed a quarter mile back for the next 40 minutes, through 2 curves, and a hill crest where most trucks would have closed the gap or dropped off it entirely depending on their gearing. I slowed down 10 miles an hour outside Big Piney, just to see what would happen. The gap held. I sped back up. The gap held again, like the truck behind me had a string tied to my bumper. I've had company on this road plenty of times. Two trucks running the same lane for 100 miles isn't unusual when there's only one road between two towns. What made this different came about 20 minutes later. I had a pickup that wasn't on my planned stop sheet that week. A feed store outside Marbleton that had called in a will call the day before. And to get to it, I had to come off the highway onto a gravel county road for about 0.8 of a mile, load 2 pallets, and come back out the same way. It's the kind of turn nobody makes unless they know that feed store is there, because there's no sign for it from the highway, and the turn itself is easy to miss, even with a GPS pin. I made that turn. 40 seconds later, so did the truck behind me. I sat in that lot longer than I needed to after the pallets were loaded, just watching. The other truck had pulled off onto the shoulder of the gravel road instead of following me all the way in. Engine running, lights on, not going anywhere. When I pulled back out onto 191, it waited maybe 90 seconds, and then eased in behind me again. Same gap as before, like nothing had happened. I got a better look at it 40 minutes later at the Sinclair in Farson, where I stopped to top off and use the restroom. It was an older Freightliner, dry van, same as mine, dark red under the sodium lights, and it pulled in and parked 2 pump islands down, instead of coming up next to me, which struck me as odd since the lot was otherwise empty. The trailer said Sweetwater Hauling LLC in paint that didn't look like it came off a shop letterer, more like it had been done freehand with a brush, the kerning uneven, the S in Sweetwater slightly taller than the rest. Down near the bottom corner of the trailer, where the paint had started to peel back from road salt, I could see the ghost of another word underneath it, another name entirely, though I couldn't make out what it said from where I was standing. Nobody got out of that cab the whole time I fueled. No exhaust plume rising off the stacks either, which meant it wasn't idling to keep the engine warm, and no fresh melt pattern on the hood or windshield, which meant it hadn't been running hard just minutes before like mine had. It looked like it had been sitting there a good while already, like it beat me to that stop instead of trailing in behind me, and that didn't square with the truck I'd been watching in my mirror for the last hour. The kid behind the counter, when I paid for my fuel, asked if I was running with somebody tonight, nodding out toward the lot. I told him no, and asked if he recognized the truck. He said he'd seen it before, maybe 2 or 3 times over the past year, always after dark, never during the day, and it never bought fuel there even though it parked at his pumps. Different plates each time he'd noticed, once Wyoming, once what he thought was Nevada. He said it the way you'd mention a stray dog that shows up in your yard every few months, not with any real alarm, just an observation he'd filed away because it didn't fit a pattern he could explain. I got back on the road with that sitting in my stomach, in a way I didn't love, and I watched my mirrors the rest of the way into Rock Springs, but I never saw those headlights behind me again that night. I told myself I'd lost him, or he'd turned off somewhere I hadn't clocked, and by the time I pulled into the motel lot around 10, I'd mostly talked myself out of thinking about it at all. Then I saw it parked in the far corner of the lot. Same red Freightliner, same trailer, engine off, no exhaust, sitting dark under a security light that didn't quite reach that corner. I hadn't told anybody where I was stopping that night. I'd booked the room from my phone 40 minutes earlier, while I was still rolling, on an app, no call to the desk, nothing anybody could have overheard on a scanner. And yet there it was, already parked, already still, like it had beaten me there the same way it had beaten me to the gas station. I backed my own rig in on the opposite side of the lot, about 60 yards off, close enough to the building that I could see my unit from the window if I wanted to. I called my wife, told her the run was uneventful, didn't mention any of it, and turned in, a little after 11, with my phone charging on the nightstand, and the curtain cracked open enough that I could see my rig's marker lights from the bed. I woke up somewhere around 2 in the morning to a truck engine turning over, that low diesel rattle before it catches, and by the time I got to the window, the red Freightliner was already pulling out of the lot, running dark, no headlights on until it hit the street. I stood there a minute in the cold coming off the glass, then went back to bed, telling myself it had just been some other driver on his own clock, nothing to do with me. It was still dark when I woke up again a few hours later, close to 6, and something made me look out that window before I even thought about coffee. There was fresh snow on the ground from overnight, maybe half an inch, enough to hold a print clean. And around my rig, in a rough circle about 20 feet out, there were boot prints. Not a few, a lot of them, overlapping in places like whoever made them had walked that same loop more than once. Slow, deliberate, no direction where they seemed to be heading anywhere, just around and around the truck. The prints came from the direction of the far corner of the lot, where the Freightliner had been sitting, and they went back to that same spot, closing a loop that started and ended at a parking space that was now empty. I stood at that window a long time before I made myself go outside. The prints didn't come near the cab door or the steps. Nothing that would have set off the motion light I keep wired to the battery, which told me whoever it was had stayed just outside that 15-foot radius the whole night, close enough to watch, careful enough not to get seen doing it. I followed the loop around to the back of the trailer, and that's when I found the seal wasn't the one I'd written on my paperwork. It was a seal, same color, same general shape, but the number stamped into it didn't match the number on my bill of lading, which meant somebody had cut the original sometime in the night and locked it back up behind a different one, hoping I wouldn't check closely enough to notice the mismatch. I called it into the terminal before I even got the truck warmed up. Dispatch that morning was a guy named Roy, who'd been doing this longer than I had, and he took it seriously enough to have me break the seal myself, right there in the lot, and go through the trailer pallet by pallet against my manifest. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been added that I could find. Whatever had happened in that trailer overnight, if anything had happened at all beyond the seal being swapped, it wasn't for the freight itself, or at least not freight I could account for. Roy told me to file a police report anyway and get back on schedule, and I did both, though the officer who took the report in Rock Springs mostly just wrote it down without much more than a nod, the kind of report that goes into a drawer. I didn't sleep well the next few nights, and when I ran that same lane the following week, I found something that put the whole thing on a different footing. I keep a jump seat in the sleeper with a zippered cushion, and when I went to grab a phone charger that had slid down behind it, my hand came up against a laminated card, wedged into the gap between the cushion and the wall. It was a CDL, water damaged. The photo faded but still readable. A man, maybe mid-40s, dark hair, a name I didn't recognize, issued out of Utah. It hadn't been there before that trip to Rock Springs. I keep that cushion clean. I check behind it for exactly this reason. Dropped phones. And there was no way I'd have missed a laminated card sitting in plain sight for 6 days running. Whoever had circled my truck that night in the snow hadn't stayed outside it after all. Somebody had gotten into my cab, into my sleeper, close enough to leave something behind. Whether on purpose or by accident I couldn't say, and I hadn't heard a thing. I stopped sleeping in that truck at motels after that. I ran hours I probably shouldn't have, pushing to make it home, or to a terminal with a locked yard instead of an open lot, and Denise started asking why I sounded worn thin on our calls. I didn't tell her the whole of it, just that the run had gotten to me, which wasn't a lie so much as it was most of the truth. 3 weeks after the boot prints, running that same stretch a little after 9 at night, I saw the red Freightliner again, a quarter-mile back, same as the first time. This time I was ready for it. I'd been keeping a notepad clipped to my visor, and when a long straight opened up past Eden with nothing but flat ground on either side, I eased off just enough to let it close some distance, and when its headlights swept wide on a bend behind me, I got the plate, wrote it down, without looking away from the road more than I had to. 3 letters, 4 numbers, Wyoming plate. In that same sweep of light, I caught the shape of the driver for maybe half a second. An ordinary-looking man, heavy-set through the shoulders, a ball cap pulled low. Nothing about him that would have stood out to me on a loading dock or behind a counter anywhere in the state. That plainness sat with me worse than if I'd seen something I could point to and call wrong. I flagged down a trooper the next morning at the port of entry outside Rock Springs before I even got my paperwork stamped. Laid out the whole thing, the tailing, the fuel stop, the prints in the snow, the seal, the license card, the plate I'd finally gotten. He didn't look surprised the way I expected him to. He pulled a small notebook out of his own jacket, not a department file, just his own running list, and told me I wasn't the first driver to come to him with something close to this exact story, off this stretch of highway over the past year or so. A few other names, Other companies. Always at night. Always a red or maroon dry van. Always plates that didn't hold steady, from one sighting to the next. Nothing had ever escalated to a theft they could prove. Nothing anybody could build a case around. Just drivers who felt watched. And one, before me, who'd found scratch marks around his own trailer doors that never amounted to a broken seal. 2 weeks later, it stopped being just a story I was telling myself to explain scratch marks. I was running the stretch between Farson and the Eden turnoff, close to 11 at night, black ice patches under fresh wind drift, no shoulder to speak of, where the snow fence lines the road, when the Freightliner came up on me fast. Brights on, right on my bumper close enough that I lost him in my mirror entirely, then swung out into the oncoming lane alongside me and held there, matching my speed, close enough that if I'd so much as breathed toward the center line we'd have traded paint. I had nowhere to go. Drift on the right, him on the left, ice under both. I got on the CB and started calling out my mile marker to anybody listening, more out of instinct than any real plan. And about 10 seconds later, a YDOT sanding truck came around the bend ahead of us, with its rotating amber beacons lighting up the whole stretch, and the Freightliner dropped back and peeled off onto a turnaround before the sander even got close enough to notice anything wrong. I pulled off myself about a mile past that, hazards on, hands shaking too hard to hold the wheel steady, and sat there until my heart came down out of my throat. I reported that one to the state police directly, not through the local desk. And this time, somebody drove the corridor for 2 nights running, looking for a red or maroon Freightliner, with a Wyoming plate matching what I'd given them. They didn't find it. It didn't show up at the Sinclair. Didn't show up in any lot I ran through for the next 6 weeks. And slowly, I let myself believe it was over. The way you let yourself believe a toothache is gone, right up until it isn't. It was Roy, who called me about the plate, close to 2 months after the night on the ice. He'd known somebody who worked with a regional carrier enforcement group, the kind of unofficial network dispatchers use to run down brokers who skip out on freight bills, and he'd finally gotten someone to run the number for him as a favor. He called me at home on a Sunday, and I remember exactly where I was standing in the kitchen when he told me. The plate came back registered to a truck reported stolen a little over a year before my first sighting of it, taken from a driver out of Utah who'd called in a fuel stop off I-80 one evening, said he was running behind, and was never heard from again. No body, no truck, nothing, until the truck turned up abandoned 2 days later on a side road outside Rock Springs. Engine cold, cab cleaned out, except for a few personal items nobody in the family recognized as belonging to him. Before it could be impounded and processed, it was gone from that lot too, and it had been running under one plate or another, one company name painted over another, ever since. They never found the driver. The case is still open, technically, sitting in a drawer same as my own report probably is. One name added to a list a trooper keeps in his own notebook, because there's nowhere else for it to go. I think about that CDL I found wedged behind my sleeper cushion sometimes, the photo of a man I never met, and I wonder if whoever's been driving that truck all this time knew it was there, or if it had just been riding along with him the whole year. Forgotten. The same way I imagine he's forgotten how many drivers he's circled in the dark before he got to me. I still run 191 most weeks. I still stop in Farson, still gas up at that same Sinclair, and I've never seen that Freightliner again. Not once. Not in almost a year now. But I keep a notepad clipped to my visor these days no matter what lane I'm running, and I check my mirrors on that straight south of Boulder a little longer than I used to, because somewhere out there is a truck wearing a dead man's paperwork, and as far as I know, nobody's ever caught up to it yet. I'd been driving that stretch of 287 for 8 years by then, hauling wellhead equipment and drill pipe on a flatbed for a company out of Casper, and if you'd asked me before that October night, I could have told you everything about Jeffrey City without even slowing down for it. Population 11, maybe 15, on a good year. A dead uranium town. Gutted out when the mine shut down back in '82. Most of the houses boarded or hauled off entirely. Streets that don't lead anywhere because the people they were built for left 40 years ago. I'd passed through it probably 300 times, always the same. A scatter of dark buildings and one blinking stop sign, gone in under a minute. That night I was running low, lower than I like to run on that stretch, because there's nothing between Muddy Gap and Rollins worth calling a gas station except the one pump that's supposed to be dead in Jeffrey City. Dusk was already going to full dark, a thin fog sitting low over the sagebrush, the way it does in autumn out there, and I remember thinking I'd be pushing it to make Rollins on fumes. So when I came around that last bend and saw light, actual light, spilling out of windows I'd never once seen lit in 8 years, I about ran off the shoulder, just staring at it. The diner sign was on, not flickering, not half dead, just on, glowing that dull orange like it always had power. There were cars in the lot, 6 or 7 of them, parked at the kind of careless angles people park when they're not thinking about it, when it's just another Tuesday. I sat there a second, with my hand still on the wheel, telling myself I'd gotten turned around somehow, that this wasn't the town I thought it was. But the water tower said Jeffrey City, in faded white letters, same as it always had. And there was the pump, lit up too, an old guy in a canvas coat, already walking toward my truck, like he'd been waiting on me. He didn't use a card reader. He just started pumping, hand on the nozzle, told me it'd be cash inside when I was done, and something about how easy he said it, how normal, made the hair on my arms stand up even while the rest of me was just relieved to be getting fuel. I told myself the town must have had some kind of revival I hadn't heard about. Companies do that sometimes, buy up dead towns for man camps, work crews. It made sense. I walked into that diner telling myself a story that made sense. Inside, it was warm, and it smelled like coffee and fry grease, and there were maybe a dozen people in booths, a couple at the counter, and every single one of them looked up when the bell over the door rang and said something friendly, welcoming, like they'd rehearsed it. "A trucker, huh?" one man said, nodding at my jacket before I'd said a word about what I did. I sat at the counter, and a waitress poured me coffee I hadn't ordered yet and told me the pie was fresh. And it wasn't until I'd taken my first sip that I noticed the newspaper folded up by the register, and the date on it was wrong. Not wrong like a misprint. Wrong like decades wrong. I remember laughing it off in my head, thinking it was one of those retro diners that print fake old papers for the atmosphere, the kind of place that wants you to feel like you stepped back in time. I asked the waitress, just making conversation, how business was, figuring maybe there was a new crew working the old mine, something to explain the lights and the cars, and the polite dozen people eating pie in a town that had no business having any of them. She said the mine was running fine, 3 shifts now, boys coming down from Riverton for the swing, and I sat there with my coffee halfway to my mouth, because I knew for a stone-cold fact that mine had been shut since before I was in grade school. I knew it, the way you know your own name. But she said it so easy, so sure, like there was nothing in the world to question about it, that I just nodded and said that's good, that's real good, and drank my coffee, instead of arguing with a woman who'd just called me Han, like she'd known me 20 years. She called me by name once too, later, when she was topping off my cup. I never gave her my name. I told myself it was on my jacket, some patch I'd forgotten about, and didn't look down to check, because some part of me didn't want to know either way. I went out to grab my logbook, needed to note the fuel stop, and while I was in the cab I had the CB and the AM radio both going low, background noise, and for about 10 seconds I caught something that wasn't static, and wasn't any station I knew, a broadcast voice reading off cattle prices in a cadence nobody uses anymore, and then it was gone, back to the hiss you get for 50 miles in every direction out there, because there's nothing to bounce a signal off of. I sat with my hand on the dial for a second before I told myself it was skip, atmospheric bounce, some far-off station catching a weird night. Truckers tell themselves things. My phone buzzed right after that. Dispatch. And the guy was irritated, asking why I was 40 minutes behind my check-in when I'd told him I was just stopping for fuel. I looked at the time on my phone and it matched what he was saying, and that scared me more than anything so far, because in my head I'd been in that diner 10 minutes, maybe 12. I hadn't even finished my coffee. I told him I hit a slow patch and hung up before he could ask anything else, because I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have gotten me pulled off the road for a psych eval. I paid cash at the counter, since the old man told me the card machine was down. Always is, he said, like it was a running joke between him and everybody there. And I got back in the truck and pulled out onto 287, telling myself I'd figure it out later, that whatever it wasn't my problem. I just needed to make Rollins. About 20 miles down the road, I reached over for my invoice folder. The paperwork for the load I still had to drop, and it wasn't on the seat. I went through the whole cab twice. Before I accepted, I'd left it on the counter back at the diner. Must have set it down when I was digging for cash, and there was no way I was showing up at a yard without it. So I turned that truck around in a pullout and drove back the way I came, telling myself I'd be in and out in 5 minutes. When I came around that same bend the second time, there was nothing there. No light in the windows, no cars. The diner sign wasn't just off, it was hanging half broken off its post, swinging a little in the wind, like it had been that way for years. The pump the old man had used was rusted through at the base, the hose gone brittle and split. The kind of rust that doesn't happen in an hour, doesn't happen in a season. It was the town I'd driven past 300 times. Dead. Dark. Exactly like it was supposed to be. I sat in that cab for a long time before I made myself get out. The fog had thickened up some, sitting maybe knee-high across the lot, and my boots crunched on gravel that hadn't been disturbed by fresh tires. No tracks but my own from minutes before. I walked up to that diner door, telling my legs to move, because some other part of me was screaming to just get back in the truck, and the door gave when I pushed it, not locked, just stuck on rotted hinges. Inside it smelled like dust and old grease gone rancid, booths torn and gray, with decades of nobody sitting in them. A clock on the wall stopped at some hour that didn't mean anything anymore. And there on the counter, sitting in a clean rectangle in all that dust, like the room around it had aged 40 years and it hadn't, was my invoice folder, exactly where I'd have set it down. I stood there staring at it longer than I want to admit, and when I finally looked down at the floor, I saw only one set of prints in the dust, leading up to that counter, and back out again, and they were mine. The tread pattern off my own boots, going in fresh, going out fresh, like I was the only person who had ever walked through that door, in all the years it had sat there rotting. I didn't sleep that night once I made Rollins. I got on the CB the next evening out of some need to hear another voice call it crazy, and I told a guy I knew a little, ran the same corridor, about the lights, careful to leave out the parts that would get me laughed off the channel. He went quiet for a second, longer than static usually holds a man, and then he said, low, like he didn't like saying it, that he'd heard something like that before. Not from me, from an old boy who used to run this route years back. Said there were a few drivers over the years claimed the same thing. A diner in Jeffrey City that shows up for somebody once, usually somebody running on empty, and that the old boy who used to talk about it stopped being able to find the town in his stories at all after a while. Like something about talking too much closed the door on him. He told me to let it go. Said guys who dig into it don't come back with anything good, just more questions and less sleep. I didn't let it go, not all the way. Sitting in a motel outside Rollins 2 nights later, I pulled up an old newspaper archive site on my phone, just typing in Jeffrey City and diner and scrolling through digitized pages from the uranium years. And about 40 minutes in, I found a grainy photograph from a local paper, a group shot inside that same diner, same counter, same stools, dated a full 2 decades before I was even born. And behind the counter, in that photograph, mid-pour, coffee pot in hand, was a woman I would have sworn under oath was the same one who'd called me Han and known my name without asking. I told myself, photographs lie, that people resemble each other, that 4 decades of exhaustion and no sleep will bend anybody's eyes into seeing what isn't there. I got back on the road because a man still got a living to make, and for a few days I almost had myself convinced the whole thing had been fatigue, black ice on the mind, nothing more. Then this past weekend I was doing laundry, going through my jacket pockets before I threw it in the wash, the same jacket I'd had on that night, and my fingers caught on something stiff in the inside pocket. A matchbook, diner cover, faded orange lettering, Jeffrey City, printed across the front, over a little cartoon of a coffee cup, the same lettering I'd seen glowing on that sign before it ever went dark on me twice in one night. I flipped it open, without thinking much of it, and printed on the inside flap, small, the way those old matchbooks always did it, was a date. A year stamped right there in plain ink. Decades before I was born. I still drive that stretch of 287. I still stop for fuel when I have to. But I keep that tank fuller now than I ever used to. And I don't let it get low anywhere near Jeffrey City. Not anymore. Not after carrying something out of there that never should have made it into my pocket in the first place. The night it happened, I was already flat on my back under the trailer with a flashlight in my teeth before I understood what I was looking at. Snow was coming sideways through the beam. The engine was ticking as it cooled. And somewhere behind me, past the guardrail, past the tree line, something was moving that had no business moving out there at 11 at night in that kind of cold. I'd been driving flatbed for about 5 years at that point, mostly pipe and oil field equipment, out of yards in Gillette and Casper, hauling to rigs scattered across the Powder River Basin, and sometimes further, into the Big Horns, and out the other side toward 10 Sleep. It's not glamorous work. You strap down joints of drill pipe or line pipe, sometimes a wellhead assembly wrapped in chains and blankets, and you drive it where it needs to go, usually alone, usually on roads that don't see much traffic once the sun goes down. I knew Route 16 better than I knew the road to my own mother's house. I knew where the frost heaves were, where the elk liked to cross, near mile marker 44, where the signal dropped out for about 6 miles, right before the summit, and picked back up on the other side. I'd crossed Powder River Pass, probably 200 times. I never once thought of it as dangerous. That's the thing nobody tells you about routine. It's the reason you stop paying attention to the small stuff. That night, the load was standard. 4 joints of line pipe and a stack of connectors bound for a site outside Buffalo, and I'd left the yard a little later than I wanted to, which put me climbing into the mountains right as the light was dying. The forecast had said flurries after midnight. What I got was snow starting a good 3 hours early. Fine and dry at first. The kind that doesn't stick so much as it dances across the pavement in these thin white ropes that the headlights turn silver. About 20 minutes before the summit, I noticed something I brushed off without thinking twice about it. The brake pedal went soft for maybe half a second. This little give under my foot, like the truck exhaled, and then it firmed right back up. I tapped it again to check, and it felt normal. If you drive for a living, you learn to file things like that under maybe nothing, and keep going. Because if you stopped and inspected the truck every time something felt 0.5% off, you'd never make a delivery in your life. I didn't know yet that I should have pulled over right then. I kept climbing. The grade up to the pass tightens the higher you go. Switchbacks cut into rock with a drop on one side that the guardrail only pretends to protect you from, and it was on one of those switchbacks, maybe a mile short of the summit sign, that the pedal went soft again, and stayed soft. I came down on it, and got almost nothing, this spongy give with no bite behind it, and for about 4 seconds my whole body went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, because a loaded flatbed with no brakes, on a mountain grade, is one of the ways this job kills people. I dropped it into a lower gear, let the engine drag me down, and worked the emergency brake in short pumps until I felt the rig start to actually slow, and I limped it into a pullout, just short of the summit, with my hands shaking on the wheel. I sat there a minute with the engine running and the heater blasting, and told myself it was a line, probably a slow leak, something I could bleed and cinch and limp home on. I had 1 bar of signal in that pullout, just enough to try dispatch, and I got about 4 words into telling Denny I had a brake problem near the summit before the call dropped and never came back. I tried 3 more times. Nothing. I remember looking at that 1 bar going to 0 and thinking, well, that's just the mountain. That's normal up here. And going back to what I actually knew how to fix, which was the truck. I grabbed my light, my coat, my gloves, and I got down on the frozen gravel and slid under the trailer to find the line. The wind had a bite to it that made my eyes water before I'd even gotten fully under, and the flashlight beam kept catching snow instead of steel. But I found it, the brake line running along the frame, and where it had failed. and even half frozen and rattled from the drive. Something about the cut didn't sit right in my head. It looked clean, not frayed, not rusted through, not scraped by a rock, the way a line gets when you clip something on a bad road. Just clean, like it had been done with a tool. I remember looking at it and thinking that was strange, and then doing what every driver does when something's strange and you're 40 minutes from anywhere. I decided it was probably just how the metal failed, filed it away same as I'd filed away the soft pedal, and kept working. That's when I heard the voice. It came from off to my left, past the shoulder, somewhere in the trees below the pullout, and it said something like, "Hey there, you need a hand." A man's voice, calm, almost friendly, pitched to carry over the wind, but not shouting. I froze under that trailer with the light still in my hand and did the math real quick. No headlights behind me, no engine idling anywhere close, no vehicle I'd seen pull in while I was under there. And yet somebody was 50, 60 feet off the road in pitch dark and blowing snow, offering to help a stranger with his brakes. I called back that I had it handled, thanks anyway, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. He said it again, same words, near enough, same easy tone, like he hadn't heard me, or hadn't cared to. You need a hand. And that's when the small stuff started stacking up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. There was no crunch of boots in snow getting closer, no shift in where the voice was coming from, nothing that told me a person was actually walking toward me through timber in the dark, the way a person walking through timber in the dark actually sounds. It was just the voice, flat and steady, like it was coming from a spot that wasn't moving, even though logically, a man offering to help should have been moving toward the guy stuck at midnight in a snowstorm. I told myself hunters camp out here. Ranch hands live up these draws. Plenty of reasons for a guy to be on foot near the pass at night. I told myself that right up until I turned my head and caught, low in the beam of my own flashlight where it spilled past the edge of the trailer, a boot print in the fresh snow by the passenger side running board. Not mine. Bigger, wet at the edges, like it had just been made. And it was on the wrong side of the truck from where that voice in the trees was supposedly standing. Somebody had already been at my cab. I don't remember deciding to move. 1 second I was flat on the gravel working out what that print meant, and the next, I was sliding out from under the trailer fast enough to scrape my jacket clean through. Flashlight beam swinging wild, and in that swing of light, I caught something at the front corner of the truck. A shape pulling back out of the beam quicker than a man that size should have been able to move. And I did not stop to get a second look. I ran the 8 feet to my door, hauled myself up into the cab, and slammed and locked it in one motion with my heart, going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I sat there, gripping the wheel, breathing like I'd run a mile, staring at my own side mirror, waiting for something to fill it. Nothing did. I grabbed my phone off the dash and it showed no service. Not one bar, not the flicker of a bar trying to find one. And the CB, when I keyed it, gave me nothing back but a long hiss. Dead air where 30 seconds earlier, sitting in that same pullout, I'd had at least enough signal to start a call. I told myself, the mountain does that. Terrain kills radio, same as it kills a phone. But some part of my brain that wasn't interested in comforting me pointed out that I'd had a bar right before I got under the truck, and I had none now, and that felt less like geography and more like something had gone quiet on purpose. Sitting still wasn't an option. I dropped the truck into gear and started rolling downgrade off the summit, figuring I could get low enough to pick up signal and find a place to pull off where there were other people, lights, anything. The brakes had almost nothing left in them, so I rode the Jake, kept it in a low gear, and worked the pedal in short taps, the way you're taught, for exactly this kind of failure. And even doing everything right, I felt that trailer start to push the tractor on one of the switchbacks, felt the whole rig want to run away downhill with me in it. And for a stretch of maybe 90 seconds, I was fighting a fully loaded flatbed, on a mountain grade, in the dark, with brakes that were barely there, snow coming harder now, and no idea if there was a runaway ramp anywhere close enough to save me, if I lost it completely. I got it slowed, got it under some kind of control, engine screaming in low gear, and that's when headlights showed up in my mirror. Relief hit me before caution did, which I'm not proud of, but a set of headlights behind you on an empty mountain road at midnight, after what I'd just been through, feels like the whole world deciding to be kind to you again. I eased off a little, ready to wave the guy around or flag him down, and instead, the lights just sat back there, holding my exact distance, no matter what my speed did. I sped up on a straight stretch, testing it. The gap didn't close, and didn't open. I slowed, coming into a curve, and the gap held there too, like whoever was back there wasn't trying to catch up or pass, just trying to stay close enough to watch. By the time I came down off the worst of the grade, there was a wide gravel pull for a ranch entrance, with a yard light burning, and I swung into it harder than I should have, tires breaking loose in the gravel, and I sat there watching my mirror with my hand on the door, in case I needed to bail toward that light. The headlights behind me slowed at the entrance, held there just long enough that I could feel eyes on the back of my truck, and then kept going down the highway and didn't come back. I don't know if that was a scared local who'd seen a truck fighting for its life on the grade and hung back out of decency, or something else entirely. I've turned it over more nights than I want to admit, and never landed anywhere solid. I got enough signal at that ranch entrance to reach dispatch and a tow outfit out of Buffalo, and by early morning the rig was up on a lift, in a shop with fluorescent lights, doing a much better job than my flashlight ever could. The mechanic, an older guy who'd clearly seen every way a truck can fail, had me come stand under the trailer with him, and he ran his finger along that brake line without touching it, and asked me, real quiet, if I'd cut this myself for some reason. I told him no. He looked at it another second and said it again, softer, like he already knew the answer and didn't like it. That's not a break, son. That's a cut, clean through, done with something sharp and done on purpose, and he wanted to know who I'd made angry enough to do it. I stood there with my hands in my pockets running through everybody I could think of. A driver I'd reported a few months back, for messing with straps on loads that weren't his, who lost his job over it, and made sure I heard how he felt about that before he left the yard for good. A dispatcher's cousin I'd had words with over a load that got double booked. A guy at a truck stop outside Gillette who didn't like how I'd looked at his girl. None of it added up to somebody driving up a mountain pass in a snowstorm to cut a brake line and then stand in the trees watching to see if it worked. I still don't have an answer for him. I've hauled that same stretch of 16 a dozen times since, always in daylight if I can help it, always checking under that trailer before I climb in, no matter how tight the schedule is. And every time I come up over that pass and catch the tree line sliding by in the dark on either side, I think about that voice, calm and even, telling me I needed a hand. And I think about how it never once moved closer. And I think about that print in the snow on the wrong side of the truck. Somebody out there knows exactly who they are and exactly what they did that night. I'm the only one left who doesn't. I've hauled the same lane for 22 years now. Casper to Sundance and back. Standing load. Same shipper. Same days. Tuesday out and Thursday back. Dry van. Nothing exciting in the trailer. Usually paper goods or hardware. Sometimes machine parts wrapped in plastic. 22 years on I-25, north out of Casper, up through Casey, up through Buffalo, then east on I-90, through Gillette and Moorcroft, all the way to Sundance. I could run that stretch with my eyes shut. I knew where the frost heaves were, before the state ever patched them. I knew which rest area had the good coffee, and which one had the bathroom you didn't want to use after dark. I knew the mile markers the way you know the furniture in your own house, not because you're looking at it, just because it's always been where it's always been. That's what made the first one so strange. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing about this was dramatic, not at first. And that's the part people don't understand when I try to explain it. It was a Tuesday in late October, maybe 6 in the evening, sun already down behind the ridge, and I was running north past Casey, where the land opens up flat and dark on both sides. There's a marker out there, 214, right before a long bend, and I'd used it my whole career to judge my speed coming into that curve. That night, it wasn't there, just a bare metal post with nothing on it, like somebody had unbolted the sign and driven off. I figured maintenance, storm damage, maybe, or some kid with a truck and a chain. That happens more than people think. I didn't think much of it until the next week. Same day, same time. And the post wasn't just bare. It was gone. Not knocked over. Not lying in the ditch. Gone. Like it had never been sunk into that ground at all. And the marker just past it, 213, was gone too. 2 markers missing in a week. No cones. No work trucks. No notice on the radio. I remember sitting with that for the better part of an hour, telling myself, Wyoming DOT doesn't move fast enough to explain 2 markers vanishing clean in 7 days. Then the exit numbers changed. Exit 78. The one for the truck stop outside Buffalo I'd used 1,000 times. The sign said 80. Not a new sign bolted over the old one either. No fresh paint smell. No construction barrels. Just 80 sitting there like it had said 80 my whole life. I called it in to my dispatcher, a woman named Lorraine, who'd been doing this longer than me, and she pulled up the state bulletins while I sat idling on the shoulder. Nothing. No renumbering project, no notice. Nothing filed with the county either. She told me maybe I misremembered. I told her I've been getting off at exit 78 since before her youngest was born. I brought it up on the CB that night, out of habit more than anything. Just talking into the dark, the way you do on a long haul. There was a driver I knew from the channel, went by sideways, ran a similar lane for a competing outfit, and he came back right away. Said he'd noticed the same thing. Said the mile markers out past Casey had been giving him trouble too. Said it felt like driving through a rerun where somebody changed one line of the script. That settled something in me, hearing him say it. Made it feel less like my head, and more like the road. The next week I tried to raise him again. Same channel, same stretch, nothing. Dead air where he usually was. When I got into Sundance, I called his company's dispatch out of pure curiosity. Asked if Sideways was running late. The woman on the line told me he'd retired the spring before. Hadn't hauled a load in over a year. I sat with the phone against my ear, a long time after she hung up, because I'd talked to that man a week earlier. Heard his voice clear as anything. Heard him laugh at his own joke about the renumbered exit. A man who, according to his own company, hadn't been on a road in 12 months. Around that same stretch of weeks, there was a billboard, used to advertise a diner called Bess's. Home cooking. Been there as long as I'd been driving. One night, it was just black letters on a white board. No diner name, no picture of pie. Just a short line that read, "You still owe me the toll." I laughed the first time I saw it. Thought it was some new ad campaign nobody explained the joke of. But it stuck with me strange. Because when I was 19, long before I ever drove for a living, I used to run that same stretch of road with my uncle in his truck. And there was an old toll booth out past there that closed before I was born, and it was a joke between us. Him telling me I owed him for the ride every single time. Nobody alive knew that joke, but him and me, and he'd been dead 11 years. I called the sign company that leased that billboard space, gave them the mile marker. The woman on the phone told me that board had been empty 2 years running. No client, no lease, nothing scheduled to go up on it until spring. By then, I'd started keeping a separate notebook, not the ELD, just a spiral pad in my cab, dates and mile markers, and whatever I'd seen, because I didn't trust my own memory anymore, to hold it straight, and some small part of me wanted proof, for whoever I'd eventually have to explain this to. I stopped one evening at a diner outside Buffalo I'd been going to for over a decade, a place called Ruby's, and the waitress who'd poured my coffee more Tuesdays than I could count, looked at me like I'd walked in off the street for the first time. Called me Han instead of my name, which she always used. Always had. And when I asked how long she'd worked there, she said she'd always worked there. Said it flat. Like the question didn't make sense to her. That night, digging through my glove box for a napkin, I found an old receipt from that same diner, years back. And the name printed at the top wasn't Ruby's. It was something else entirely. A name I didn't even remember the place ever having, and yet there it was, on paper, in my own hand, dated, real, which meant somewhere along the line that whole building had quietly become something else, and I'd never noticed the day it happened, never caught the seam. Not long after, my GPS started showing a spur road forking off the highway near marker 190, a thin gray line running off into the hills where my paper atlas showed nothing but empty country. One slow night, half out of curiosity and half out of something I didn't want to name, I let my foot ease toward that turn before I caught myself and kept straight. I started asking around at the truck stops, casual, like it was nothing, and found that some of the older drivers had heard talk for years about a stretch of road out past 190 that some swore by as a shortcut, and others swore had never existed at all. The kind of thing you hear passed around a break room and never think twice about until it's sitting in your own windshield. On one of my days off, I went to the library in Casper and pulled old newspapers from the year I started driving, and found a short clipping, 3 inches of column space, about a hitchhiker who'd gone missing out along that same stretch of highway. Never found. Case never closed. No name given in the piece at all. Reading that clipping is what finally pulled something loose in me that I'd kept buried over 20 years. My first year driving, green as they come, running that same lane at night. I remember swerving hard for something in the road, telling myself after it was a deer, feeling the thump under the trailer, and never stopping to check, because I was hauling a hot load, and panicking, and 22 years old, and terrified of losing the job before I'd really started it. I never told a soul. I told myself it was a deer so many times that I believed it, or thought I did, until that clipping sat in front of me, with a date that matched almost exactly. I told my wife Carol some of it, not all of it, and she got quiet the way she does when she's worried. Brought up that my father had started slipping around my age, memory-wise, and asked me to see a doctor, which I did. Full workup, and it came back clean, no impairment, sharp as ever for a man my age, and somehow that scared me worse than if they'd found something wrong, because it meant I couldn't explain any of this away, as my own mind failing me. So I started filming the dash with my phone, propped on the vent, just to have something besides my own word. And when I went back and watched the footage from a night I'd seen the marker missing, and the billboard message clear as day, the video showed neither. Showed the marker standing right where it always had. Showed the old diner ad for pie still up on the board. Whatever I was seeing wasn't landing on the lens. It was only landing on me. I called the county records office about the old highway renumbering, more out of stubbornness than hope, and a clerk who'd been there forever dug up an old DOT filing, showing that decades back, before I'd ever gotten behind a wheel for a living, those same mile markers and that same exit had carried different numbers, before a routine renumbering project cleaned it all up, which meant the road wasn't glitching forward into something new. It was sliding backward, into what it used to be, the year before that renumbering, the same year as that clipping. I asked a friend still working in payroll to pull old manifests for that lane from back then, and my own name came up on the sheet for that exact week, that exact route, the same nights the clipping talked about. The billboard changed again not long after that, and this time it wasn't vague. It named a mile marker straight out, no riddle to it anymore, like whatever was behind it had stopped being patient with me. I asked dispatch to move me off that lane entirely, figured I'd earned that much after 22 years, and got told no, that the shipper's contract had a decades-old clause requiring this specific route be run by a specifically named driver, a clause nobody in the office could explain, tied to a shipping company that had technically dissolved years back, but somehow still paid on time, every week, like clockwork. One night, against every instinct I had left, I let the wheel drift toward that spur road near marker 190 the GPS kept showing, and I followed it. The pavement went from smooth to cracked to barely pavement at all, weeds pushing up through it, clearly untouched by anything for decades. Nothing like the highway I'd left behind me 30 seconds earlier. At the end of that spur, half swallowed in brush, sat the wreck of an old rig, and I knew that paint job, knew that unit number, because it was my own truck from my first year driving, the one the company had supposedly sold off and scrapped a lifetime ago. Cold engine, driver's door hanging open, sitting there like it had been left mid-shift 22 years ago, and just been waiting. I got close enough to see something pale inside the cab, didn't let myself look longer than a second, turned and walked back to my truck faster than I've moved in years, and drove until the sun came up, and I don't remember most of those hours, not clearly, not in any way I can put into words that would satisfy anybody asking. The road's behaved itself since then, mostly, But I carry a paper map now, folded in the door pocket, and I don't run that lane after dark on the GPS anymore if I can help it. Some nights, though, it boots up on its own. And there it is, that same gray line forking off at marker 190. Same distance, same angle, sitting there patient as anything, waiting on me to make a different choice than I made the last time. I don't tell dispatch. I don't tell Carol anymore either. I just keep both hands on the wheel, keep my eyes on the real road, and drive straight through. 3 years I'd been driving reefer trailers, mostly short hauls close to home, with a co-driver, riding along half the time just for company. That June was supposed to be the one that proved I could do this job for real. My first solo run clean across the state, a full trailer of temperature-controlled pharmaceutical stock that had to stay locked at 38 degrees the entire trip, or the company ate a loss I didn't want to think about. I'd mapped the route 3 times the night before. Nebraska line, up through the basin, over Togwotee Pass, down into Idaho by morning. Nothing fancy, just miles and coffee, and a schedule I intended to beat by 2 hours. The drive up toward the pass that afternoon was the kind of pretty that makes you forget you're working. Wildfire smoke had drifted in from somewhere out west, thin enough that you didn't smell it, but thick enough to flatten the light. So the sun sat up there behind a kind of gray-white haze, not bright, not dim, just wrong, in a way I couldn't name at the time. I remember thinking the mountains looked like a photograph that had been left in a window too long, all the color bleached soft. It was 2 in the afternoon. I know that because I checked the clock right when I hit the base of the climb, because I always check the clock at the base of a climb, force of habit from 3 years of watching my hours. The CB started hissing static somewhere around the switchbacks, which isn't unusual up there, and then my phone dropped to no signal, which also isn't unusual. What was unusual was how the static didn't sound like static. It had a rhythm to it, almost a pulse, on and off, on and off. And I remember reaching to adjust the squelch and thinking that was strange. And that is the last clear thought I have before the dark. Because it was dark. Not headlights on dark. Full dark. And the clock on my dash read 9:47 p.m. And I was still driving. Still doing 62 miles an hour. Down a straight stretch of highway I didn't recognize. Hands on the wheel like I'd never left them. My first thought, the only thought that made any sense, was that I'd fallen asleep at the wheel. Every driver's worst fear. And mine had apparently come true, and somehow not killed me. I pulled off at the next wide shoulder, hazards on, heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth, and I sat there, trying to convince myself that was all it was. A long blink, a microsleep that stretched out further than it should have. It happens. Men have driven hundreds of miles on autopilot before waking up confused. I told myself that, until I believed it enough to keep driving to the next truck stop, where I planned to sleep it off and call it a lesson learned. At the truck stop, waiting on my food, I pulled up my ELD out of habit, just to log my break, and the numbers on the screen didn't match anything I just told myself. According to the device, I hadn't been driving during those missing hours at all. The log showed the truck parked, engine off, starting at 2:03 p.m., at a mile marker just shy of the summit of the pass. Parked and off for 4 hours and 11 minutes straight. Then, at 6:14, moving again, like nothing had happened. That's not a man falling asleep at the wheel. A man asleep at the wheel doesn't shut off his own engine, sit still for 4 hours, and then wake up 200 miles down the road with no memory of starting the truck back up. I did the math sitting right there in the booth, food going cold. My fuel receipts, my trip odometer, all of it lined up, like I'd been driving the whole time. No 4-hour gap in the mileage at all, which meant one of two things. Either the ELD was lying, which happens, they glitch, satellites drop, or I had somehow covered 200 miles in a window of time. The truck's own black box swore I hadn't moved an inch. I called dispatch that night, more to cover myself than anything else, expecting someone to tell me it was a known bug, a software patch they'd push next week. Instead, the woman on the line went quiet in a way that made the hair go up on my arms, and she said she'd pull the satellite ping history and call me back. When she did, 20 minutes later, Her voice had that careful, flat tone people use when they're choosing words on purpose. The GPS pings had gone dead at 2:04 p.m., 1 minute after the ELD clocked me as parked. No signal at all, not even the low-resolution fallback pings the system logs every 15 minutes as backup. Then, at 6:13, 1 minute before the truck showed moving again, the pings picked back up 200 miles west, right on schedule for where I should have been if I'd never stopped at all. Two different systems, both technically accurate, both impossible next to each other. It was the trailer that made it stop feeling like a computer error and start feeling like something else. Reefer units keep their own separate record, door sensors and temperature logs, because the company cares more about a cold chain break than almost anything else on that truck. I checked it that night out of pure nervous habit, and the log showed the rear doors had opened twice during the gap, once at 2:41 p.m. for 6 minutes, once at 4:58 for 4. Both times, the internal temperature spiked and then dropped back to spec, almost too fast, like whoever opened those doors knew exactly how long they could afford to let the cold out. I got out of the cab with a flashlight and walked back and checked the seal on the doors myself, hands not steady. It was there, intact, numbered, official looking. Problem was, it wasn't the seal number written on my paperwork. Someone had cut the original and replaced it with one that matched close enough that nobody glancing at it would notice. Except I'd written down my seal number that morning the way I always do, out of the same 3 years of habit that made me check the clock at the base of every climb. I sent all of it up the chain, expecting alarm, expecting an investigation. What I got instead was a kind of tired patience that told me more than any answer would have. A senior dispatcher, an older guy who'd been with the company almost 20 years, called me directly instead of routing it through the safety office, and he didn't sound surprised. He asked me exactly where on the pass it happened, and when I told him the mile marker, he was quiet for a second, and then said that stretch has a habit of doing that to drivers, usually in summer, usually right around midday, and that I wasn't the first one to call in with a story close to mine. He said the company doesn't put anything about it in writing, but if I wanted, they could route me around that pass on future runs, no questions asked, the way they'd done for a couple other guys over the years, who'd asked the same thing without ever being told why it mattered. That was the point where the fear stopped being about a strange afternoon and started being about how long this had been happening to other people in trucks, just like mine, quietly, without anyone connecting the dots out loud. I still had the dash cam. The dual-facing one pointed both out the windshield and back at me, standard now for insurance. Most of the footage from the missing window was just black, corrupted past recovery, like the file itself had been damaged rather than simply not recorded. But there was one clip, 90 seconds long, time-stamped 3:52 p.m., that the recovery software managed to pull. It showed me at the wheel, awake, sitting up straight, hands correctly at 9 and 3, driving down what was clearly a gravel service road, not the highway, someplace with sagebrush close on both sides, and no other traffic. My face in the cabin camera wasn't panicked or sleepy, it was just still. Slack in a way I don't think I've ever seen my own face be. Eyes open, pointed forward, not really tracking anything the way eyes do when a person is actually looking at the road ahead of them. In the last 2 seconds of the clip, something shifts in the reflection off the sleeper berth curtain behind me. Just a flicker of movement, gone before I could make sense of it, and I have watched that 90 seconds more times than I'd like to admit, trying to decide if it was my own gear sliding with the truck's motion or something else. And I have never been able to convince myself either way. Months later, on a different run that happened to route me back through that stretch of Wyoming, I couldn't let it go anymore. I pulled up the exact coordinates from that first ELD log, the spot where it swore I'd sat parked for 4 hours, and I drove to it in daylight, on purpose, parked on the shoulder, and walked out looking for whatever pull-off I must have used. There wasn't one, just a wide, cracked apron of old concrete, swallowed up in sagebrush, the kind of thing you'd walk right past if you didn't know to look for it. I mentioned it to an old rancher at a gas station 20 miles down the road, more out of curiosity than anything, and he told me without much interest that there used to be a way station right along there, before the highway got rerouted in the 70s after some kind of accident nobody talked about much anymore. Decommissioned, torn down, mostly forgotten except by people who'd lived out there long enough to remember the pavement being new. It doesn't show up on any modern map. It isn't on the company's routing software. As far as every system I use to do my job is concerned, that place doesn't exist. But it's the exact spot my ELD insists I sat parked for 4 hours, engine off, on a summer afternoon 3 years ago. The company closed the file eventually, chalked it up to a satellite dropout combined with a driver fatigue episode, standard language, standard resolution, nothing that would ever show up as anything but routine on paper. I let them close it. There wasn't anything else to do with it. I still drive reefer, still take runs across that same stretch of state, more often than I'd like, and I've gotten good at not thinking about it most days. But every single time that road climbs toward Togwoti Pass, and I see that particular bend coming up, the one with the thin light and the flat gray mountains behind it, I fill up before I get anywhere near it, and I do not touch the brakes, and I do not pull over, not for fuel, not to stretch my legs, not for anything, no matter how tired I am, or how badly my body is telling me to stop. It's the 1 mile marker on the whole map I will never let myself sit still at again.